The most forceful of the 2nd century popes is St. Victor, and he has one intervention, the date of Easter. First, this is a big question in the early church, of when should Easter be celebrated, and he convoked some synods, and he got a general agreement that on how to calculate the date of Easter. And then he communicated that to the universal church. And he asked everyone to command that. He commanded everyone to follow that date. And some churches in the Eastern Empire continued to follow their own date setting. They went to the 14th day of Nisan of the Jewish calendar instead of, often it wasn't a Sunday. And so Victor he commanded them to stop, and he actually excommunicated some bishops there who were refusing to obey. Now, an interesting point is that when he was going to do this, there were some, St. Irenaeus and some others, they went to Rome and they asked the Pope not to do this. And they said, well, look, you're going to cause a division in the church, this is going to cause hard feelings, it's better not to do this. But they didn't contest his right to do that. And in fact, he ignored them and did it. But they weren't saying you can't do this. They were saying, please don't do this, because it's going to cause problems. Maybe it's a bad policy to do this. But they never raised any doubt about his authority. St. Ignatius of Antioch was a bishop of Antioch, and he was a martyr. He was taken by the Romans, captured by them, and he was sent to Rome to be martyred in the Colosseum. And on his way there, he writes 7 letters to 7 churches through whose territory he was passing. And in 6 of those 7 letters, he gives them advice. He says, why don't you do this? Don't forget this. He's encouraging them, letters of encouragement, letters of advice on how to keep the faith. They're very important letters to understand how the early church was organized. But interestingly enough, when he writes to Rome, there is no advice at all. On the contrary, it's just the opposite. He refers to Rome as having the chief place in love, which means that it had the first place in the communion of charity, which is the church. He points out that Rome instructs other churches, implying that it enjoys a special teaching authority. So in other words, St. Ignatius didn't feel that he was in any position to give advice to Rome or to anything. All he had to do there was to praise Rome, which is what his letter does. St. Irenaeus of Lyon, in the year 180 AD, he had the Gnostics, as a heresy at that time. He was doing a great battle against them, and he was basing himself on Scripture. They were interpreting Scriptures in different ways, and so he said, well, how should Scripture be interpreted? And he says, well, we have to go back and look at how it was interpreted from the very beginning. And he says, well, the best way to do that is to look at the Roman Church. What is the practice of the Roman Church? What has the Roman Church done? That's how we'll know. She's the mother of all churches. So he says that all the churches have to conform their teaching to the teaching of Rome because of its superior origin, and it is the criteria of orthodoxy, in other words. Orthodoxy meaning right and true teaching. Now, beginning in the 2nd and particularly the 3rd and 4th centuries, the church was rent by heresies, and there were hundreds or dozens anyway, of heresies, from Arianism to Nestorianism to different errors on the Trinity, different errors on grace, different errors on the Incarnation, and all this had to be sorted out by church councils. And whenever disputes arose about the faith and they couldn't agree, the disputants went to Rome. Rome was considered to be the standard of reference in doctrinal matters and juridical matters. It was the judge of orthodoxy for the other churches. And even the heretics went to Rome. Marcion was a very important heretic, and he had his own church, and he thought his church was the right church. So he went to Rome to ask the Pope to endorse his version of Christianity. And of course the Pope refused, and he was rejected. But so not only did but people wanted their version or their theory to be ratified, they went to Rome as well. So Rome was also a court of last resort in disputes between churches. So by the end of the 3rd century, the popes themselves are using these 3 texts from Scripture that I talked about to justify their intervention in the affairs of other churches. and their right to resolve doctrinal disputes over heresies. Now, when the Edict of Milan was issued, and say in the year 313, when the Christianity became a legal entity in the empire, then the popes began to send out deputies, or legates, or representatives to different churches. They began correspondence with other bishops. And when they do, the tone of those letters is one of command, of authority. You know, they're not advice again. And when the Pope is issuing letters to the bishops throughout Europe, or throughout the Mediterranean world at that point, they are letters of command. He's not suggesting anything. He's telling them, this is, I'm solving this way, I judge this, we're going to do this. Beginning in the 4th century, the Pope begins to style himself the Vicar of St. Peter, or the successor of St. Peter. So the idea was that each Pope succeeded Peter directly. And so the term that's used, Peter continues to govern the church through the Pope, who is his successor. Another interesting point is that in the 4th century, 5th century, there are some very important church fathers. They are St. Jerome, or particularly St. Augustine, who was the most important church father, a huge, a giant, an intellectual giant, wrote volumes. Many of the other church fathers, Chrysostom, Hilary, there's some great minds there. We know much less about the popes of that time than we do about these church fathers. These were bishops or monks, and we know much more about them than we do about the popes. The popes, many of those popes didn't leave anything in writing, or almost nothing. They were just governing the church. And yet, these intellectual giants and these great saints, they defer to Rome. They are the ones who go to Rome and they accept Rome's decisions. At one point, when Augustine was fighting against the Pelagians, and they sent the whole, they had a church council, they condemned the Pelagians, and then they sent it to Rome, and when Rome gave its decision, Augustine had that famous saying, that Rome has spoken, the case is closed. And that was his summary of the Pope's authority, even though, as I say, from a point of view of intellect or probably sanctity, the first popes most of them were martyred anyway, but Augustine was a giant, yet nevertheless, he and the others deferred to the authority of the Pope. Pope Leo the Great, in the middle of the 5th century, played an important role here. He wrote a lot about the primacy of the Pope, and he had a great command of Roman law, so he's the one who elaborated somewhat more on the authority of the Pope. And he's the one who settled that dispute of the Council of Chalcedon. It was probably the most important of the early, a very important council in the year 451. And they couldn't, the East was rending itself, and they were tearing itself apart with this conflict, and they had to get it settled, so they submitted it to Rome. And Pope Leo wrote his famous work on this. It was on the two natures of Christ. He had a human nature and a divine nature, and he settled this dispute, and he sent a document to the council, and the council accepted it. Well, at least most of the council accepted it. The Egyptian bishops said, we're not going to accept this, and they left the church. They started a schism. The Coptic church is a result of the schism at the Chalcedon. But all the other bishops accepted the ruling of Leo. Nobody, and they had what the council documents is, we have received from Peter certainty of possessing the right to defend the truth. Peter had spoken through Leo, and so they accepted his judgment on this important issue.